That night, the fog opened a path and the golden light led me straight to the tomb that should never have been found.
Have you ever wondered what really happens after the cemetery gates are closed, when there's nothing left but darkness, cold wind, and hundreds of silent graves? Many believe that death is an absolute end, but those who work daily among coffins and headstones know that the night can hide secrets that defy logic and sanity. I say this because I once heard a story that left me uneasy for weeks, and even today, when I close my eyes, I feel as if I can see that scene pulsing before me. It's not a legend invented to scare children, but rather a dark confession made by an American gravedigger who swore he witnessed something that made him doubt reality itself. It was an ordinary night, moonless, with only the distant glow of streetlights on the main street dimly illuminating the iron walls. The cemetery was already empty. The last visitors had left, and the work seemed complete. But it was precisely in this moment of absolute silence that the strangeness began. He said that as he looked toward the oldest part of the cemetery, he noticed a different light, something that shouldn't be there. At first he thought it might be the reflection of headlights, or even someone using a flashlight to hide among the tombs. However, it only took a few seconds of observation to realize something was wrong. The light didn't remain constant, but instead pulsed at regular intervals, as if it were a heart beating within the earth. The sensation he described is almost impossible to convey in words. Imagine an intense red glow, appearing and disappearing in a rhythmic rhythm, casting distorted shadows on the nearby tombstones, as if everything around it was breathing along with that particular grave. The gravedigger froze for a few moments, unsure whether to ignore it and walk away or approach and find out what was really happening. With each pulse, his body reacted with shivers, and his mind screamed not to take another step toward that phenomenon. But what would you do in a situation like that? Would you turn your back and pretend nothing happened, or would you give in to your curiosity to understand why a tomb seemed alive in the darkness of the early morning? If these stories are already stirring your imagination, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that the gravediggers never had the courage to tell out loud. That Boston cemetery wasn't just a burial ground. It was a space laden with untold stories, with memories that seemed to cling to the cold stones and rusted iron gates. During the day, it was already somber, its ancient trees casting shadows that trailed across the ground. But it was at night that the silence became unbearable, as if the very air were permeated with memories that refused to fade. The gravedigger described how, on that particular night, the atmosphere seemed even heavier, and every noise that echoed in the empty space took on a terrifying proportion. The creak of a gate in the distance sounded like a metallic scream, and the wind blowing through the dried wreaths recalled the whispers of forgotten voices. He was a man accustomed to solitude and the burden of his profession. People rarely think of those who spend their early mornings tending cemeteries, raking leaves, filling graves, or simply ensuring everything remains in order. For him, each headstone held meaning. Each tomb represented a point of eternal silence, and perhaps that's why he was always attentive to what moved within those walls. But that night, what he felt wasn't just the usual routine. It was as if space were watching his every step, as if hundreds of invisible eyes were following him from within the graves. Describing the scene, he insisted there was no moon in the sky, only a shadow fueled by a creeping mist that appeared out of nowhere, partially covering the stone floor and narrow paths. The cold was so intense it seemed to bite into the bones, and the silence, broken only by the crunch of his own boots against the gravel, reinforced the idea that he was completely alone. Yet there was something different about this solitude, a nagging, almost palpable sensation that someone was breathing there with him. Each step he took toward the old part of the cemetery increased the pressure in his chest, as if the environment had become an invisible prison. And it was just when he thought there was nothing but darkness and wind that he noticed that glow emerging timidly, but disturbingly from behind the twisted trees. With each passing moment, the strangeness grew, inviting him to come closer. When her eyes first caught that glow, her mind searched for simple explanations. Perhaps some young man had sneaked into the cemetery to play a prank, using a red flashlight or even a cheap store-bought flare. That was the logical answer, the one that would soothe any frightened heart. However, it only took a few seconds to realize there was nothing normal about that. Brightness. The light wasn't static like that of an artificial object. It was breathing. Yes, it was breathing, as if it were alive, appearing and disappearing at regular intervals, reminiscent of the beating of a human heart. With each beat, the shadows of the trees and crosses lengthened and shrank in perfect synchrony, creating the sensation that the entire cemetery was following that morbid rhythm. The gravedigger said he stood paralyzed for a moment, his eyes fixed on the distant point, where the light appeared. He described the sensation as a mixture of hypnosis and repulsion. Part of his mind screamed to leave and lock the gates immediately, but another part, driven by an almost unhealthy curiosity, wanted to discover what was behind this phenomenon. After all, in all his years of service, he had never witnessed anything like it. Lanterns go out, spotlights break, but never before has a tomb emit a light that pulsates like living flesh. He took a few hesitant steps toward the glow. The sound of his boots hitting the ground seemed louder than usual, and each dry crack of leaves sounded like bones crunching. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the light was coming from a specific tomb, an ancient stone tomb, worn by time and forgotten by its families. The gravedigger's heart raced, and for a moment he thought he could hear his own blood rushing in his ears in sync with the light pulsing ahead. It was at that moment that he realized this was no mere illusion. Something there was alive, or at least wanted to appear alive, and against all logic, he decided to keep moving forward. He took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor that was beginning to grip his hands. Each step he took toward the glow seemed to increase the weight of the silence, as if the entire cemetery was simultaneously holding its breath. The wind suddenly ceased, and even the rustling of dry leaves fell silent, leaving only the rhythmic sound of his own heartbeat competing. With the red pulse emanating from the tomb, it was as if the ground vibrated in unison, transmitting the same rhythm through the gravel and roots. A disturbing reminder that he was approaching something that should not be seen. As the distance closed, the gravedigger began to notice details that had previously seemed irrelevant. The air was warmer in that part of the cemetery, an unnatural warmth that contrasted with the cold Boston night. With each pulse, it was not only the light that intensified, but also the feeling of oppression that enveloped him. His lungs seemed to shrink, making it difficult to breathe, and an invisible pressure pressed against his chest as if trying to prevent him from taking the next step. Instincts screamed to stop, but morbid curiosity drove him forward, trapped in a trance from which he could not break free. When he finally reached within a few meters of the grave, the glow revealed even more frightening contours. The letters engraved on the headstone reflected the light at strange angles, casting shadows that seemed to form invisible words, like hidden messages, just waiting for whoever dared to decipher them. The pulsing had become faster, more intense, as if reacting to his approach, inviting him to come even closer. The gravedigger instinctively reached out, hesitating for a few seconds before touching the cold stone that now seemed alive. It was at that moment that he noticed something even more disturbing. The ground around the tomb trembled slightly, barely perceptible, but enough to make the gravel vibrate beneath his feet. He felt as if he were standing on the chest of a sleeping giant, feeling each slow, deep beat reverberate through the ground. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the heavy air that seemed to condense around him. And then, just when he thought nothing could get any stranger, he heard a muffled sound that came neither from the wind nor from the branches. They were whispers, discreet, scratching at the edge of comprehension, like voices trapped deep within the earth, calling his name. He stood motionless before the tomb, his eyes wide, trying to decipher what was really happening, when the muffled sound became clear. It was no longer just an indistinct murmur, but words repeated in a desperate rhythm, as if someone were begging for help from within the stone. The sentence was short, but charged with a desperation that cut through logic. "Get me out of here." With each repetition, the voice seemed to gain strength, as if struggling to break through the layers of earth, cement, and marble that imprisoned it. The gravedigger described how, for a moment, he believed there was actually someone alive inside, buried by mistake, slowly suffocating as they begged for help. His heart raced. Sweat trickled down his temples as his mind struggled to grasp any rational explanation. Was it a hallucination caused by fear and fatigue? Was it the wind passing through cracks in the stone, creating a sound like human words? Or was it, in fact, the manifestation of something that should never have a voice after death? He placed his hand on the surface of the tomb, and the sensation made his blood run cold. The stone, which should have been cold as ice, seemed to vibrate beneath his skin, warm, pulsing, almost organic, as if it were a human chest trying to breathe. For a moment, the gravedigger backed away, convinced he should run and leave the place. But the further he walked, the louder the whispers grew, following him, echoing in his mind as if they were inside his own skull. And with each step, the plea grew more insistent, more piercing, more human, until he could no longer ignore it. His survival instinct and the weight of duty clashed, tearing his sanity in two opposite directions. It was then, overcome with anguish and fear, that he approached again, determined to face the impossible. And what he felt when he touched the tomb for the second time drove him to the brink of madness. Touching the stone didn't bring relief, it brought despair. The gravedigger said he felt as if he'd touched raw flesh, a pulsating heat that seemed to penetrate his skin and spread through his veins, contaminating him from within. It was impossible, but the sensation was identical to placing a hand on the chest of someone struggling to breathe, as if a body were buried there, beating and begging to be released. In that instant, his mind split into two paths. On the one hand, the moral and professional obligation to verify that a human being wasn't trapped there by mistake. On the other, the paralyzing terror of being faced with something that should never be awakened. He closed his eyes, trying to gather his thoughts. But the whispers continued, growing clearer, closer and closer, until there seemed to be no stone between him and the voice. "Get me out of here, and get me out of here." The repetition became torture, an invisible chain pulling him deeper into that tomb. His hands trembled, his legs threatened to give way, and for a moment he believed he would lose consciousness right there in the middle of the night, alone, surrounded only by the dead. The dilemma grew with each passing second. If someone was truly alive, not acting would mean being complicit in a slow and cruel murder. But if this was merely a reflection of his tormented mind, or worse, something that didn't belong in the world of the living, disturbing that tomb could open a door that would never close. Fear turned to panic, and panic to paralysis. He described feeling as if he were trapped in a lucid nightmare where every choice led to the abyss. And then, in a desperate gesture, he pressed his palm against the stone again. It was at that moment that he realized he wasn't just hearing the whispers, but also feeling them vibrate beneath his skin, as if the voice were within his body. The heat increased, the pulse quickened, and he was absolutely certain this was no ordinary tomb. Gradually, the whispers turned into muffled screams, and his breathing mingled with that suffocating presence. And it was precisely at that moment, at the height of the conflict between reason and insanity, that something happened. The next moment was described as the most terrifying of the Gravedigger's entire life. He recounted that just as he believed he was about to lose his sanity, the tomb's pulse accelerated brutally, like a heart collapsing. The red light exploded in a flash so intense that it illuminated the entire cemetery, causing the tombstones and trees to cast monstrous shadows that stretched to the horizon. It was as if the night had transformed into a living nightmare, and every cross, every statue, every tombstone had gained eyes that watched him silently. The air became heavy, impossible to breathe, and the heat coming from the stone burned like fire against his skin. In that flash, he swears he heard not just one voice, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, all crying out at once. Voices of men, women, the elderly, and even children, all united in a desperate chorus, crying out for help, begging for release. The screams were so loud they seemed to pierce his bones, vibrating inside his head until it was impossible to distinguish what was coming from outside and what was coming from within his own mind. It was like standing before a crowd trapped in an invisible prison, trying to break through the walls of the afterlife to grab him and drag him along. Desperate, the gravedigger retreated a few steps, stumbling on the gravel, but the sensation of the entire ground vibrating with the flash prevented him from truly moving away. He fell to his knees, covering his ears in vain, for the sound came from everywhere at once. He closed his eyes, but the red seeped through his eyelids like liquid fire, burning away any shred of reason. It was at that point that he believed himself doomed, certain he would never make it out alive or with his sanity intact. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything ceased. The glow faded, the screams fell silent, and the heat dissipated like smoke. When he opened his eyes, he found only the silent tomb, cold and still, as if nothing had happened. The shadows returned to ordinary shadows, the wind returned gently, and the cemetery looked the same as ever. But inside, nothing would ever be normal again. The gravedigger knelt before the tomb for long minutes, unable to believe the silence that had fallen over the place. The contrast was so brutal that it made him question whether it had really happened, or if his mind, exhausted by the weight of years of work among the dead, had created a delirium to torment him. He touched the stone once more, and now it was cold as ice, completely inert, as if it had never pulsed or emitted a single glow. Reason told him it was impossible, but his body still trembled, the sweat still poured, and the screams echoed in his memory like invisible scars. That night, he hastily locked the gates and could never again walk through the cemetery without feeling someone watching him from deep within. He recounted the incident with a choked voice, vowing never to approach that tomb again. For him, the explanation lay not in legends or tricks of the light. It lay in that which cannot be seen, but which insists on manifesting itself when the silence of dawn gives way to the impossible. And perhaps that's precisely what scares us most, the idea that the dead aren't completely silent, that something still pulses beneath the earth, waiting just for the right moment to be heard again. He told me, his eyes welling up, that he never slept peacefully after that night, because he knew that somewhere in the cemetery a heart continued beating beneath the cold stone. But what disturbed him most was discovering shortly afterward that this wasn't the only story involving unexplained lights among graves. Another gravedigger from a different state reported seeing an old headstone glow an intense blue, and what happened when he approached was even more disturbing than anything he'd just heard. Have you ever heard of cemeteries that seem to come to life when night falls? I'm not referring to vague figures or noises that can be explained by the wind, but to phenomena so concrete and disturbing that even the most skeptical fall silent when they hear such reports. I clearly remember the expression on a New Orleans gravedigger's face when he described what he saw one early morning, an experience that made him question whether there was still a line between the living and the dead. He wasn't a man given to exaggeration, much less one who sought attention with fabricated stories. On the contrary, he was reserved, hardened by the daily grind of dealing with the silence of the graves. But that night, something happened before his eyes, and from then on, he never walked the cemetery corridors without feeling something watching his every step. Imagine yourself in his shoes. The clock strikes just after midnight. The streets are already deserted, and the city sleeps under the heavy humidity of the American South. Inside the cemetery, the air seems even denser, charged with centuries of history buried beneath the stone tombs. It is in this setting that something impossible happens. An ancient, weathered tombstone begins to emit an intense blue glow, illuminating the surrounding trees as if it were a supernatural lantern. It wasn't a reflection of electric light, nor some trick played by vandals. The glow seemed to come from within the stone, as if it were breathing, projecting a cold clarity that spread in silent waves through the low-lying fog. The gravedigger said that for a moment he thought he was going mad. However, the more he observed, the more he realized that the light had a rhythm, an irregular, almost organic rhythm. And against all logic, he began to feel that the cemetery itself was reacting to the phenomenon, as if every tree, every cross, and every statue were trapped by the same spell. What he discovered as he approached wasn't just disturbing, it was something that would make anyone doubt their own sanity. If these stories are already stirring your imagination, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that the gravediggers never had the courage to tell out loud. New Orleans is a city known for carrying not only music and culture through its streets, but also a spiritual burden that seems to permeate every corner. Cemeteries there are not simple resting places. They are stone. Labyrinths elevated above the earth, built to protect the dead from the waters that insistently invade the ground. For those who enter their gates at night, it is not only the darkness that frightens, but the weight of the stories that accumulate like an invisible shroud over each grave. The gravedigger told me that night, the atmosphere felt different, as if the city itself had fallen silent so that only the cemetery could breathe. The air was heavy and humid. The tomb walls were covered in moss, and the moon, hidden behind heavy clouds, left the place in the almost absolute domain of darkness. He described the sensation of walking through those narrow corridors as if he were passing through a profane temple. Every angel statue seemed to watch him with stony eyes. Every cross seemed another reminder that he was trespassing on territory where he shouldn't remain for long. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel mingled with the distant echo of water drops falling from the roofs of the tombs, composing a funereal symphony that reinforced the solitude. It wasn't the first time he'd made the nightly rounds, but that night, he said, he felt as if the stone walls held secrets that could no longer bear the silence. At every turn, the wind seemed to carry indecipherable murmurs, and the creeping fog slowly crept in, covering the ground like a pale blanket. It was in this suffocating scene that a blue light began to emerging between the oldest tombstones. Instead of feeling relieved to finally see a light amidst the darkness, the gravedigger realized that this only made the surroundings even more macabre. It was as if the cemetery, until then dormant, had awakened to witness what was about to unfold. And it was at that moment that he understood that he was not just facing a strange vision, but the beginning of something that would completely challenge his understanding of reality. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to convince himself that what he saw was merely an illusion of his tired mind. It could have been the reflection of a car passing on a nearby street, or perhaps a faulty light bulb flickering on a distant balcony. His reason desperately searched for a logical explanation, something that could transform the vision into a simple urban detail lost in the early hours. However, the more he observed, the more impossible it became to sustain this idea. The light wasn't static. It didn't follow the pattern of any artificial object. It seemed to originate from within the tombstone, as if emanating from its cracks, pulsing in irregular intervals, similar to the breathing of someone struggling to breathe. The bluish hue didn't resemble anything natural. It was cold and metallic, unlike the warm glow of a candle or the ordinary glow of a lamp. There was something otherworldly about this blue, as if it came from a place that shouldn't exist. The gravedigger said that, as he watched from afar, he felt as if the light expanded in waves, illuminating the nearby trees and creating distorted reflections on the stone walls. The sensation was that the light was alive, growing, trying to attract whoever dared to face its strangeness. He tried to convince himself that he didn't need to approach, that he could simply turn and walk away. But at the same time, he felt the light calling to him, as if it had a secret purpose in manifesting itself just for him. It was impossible to ignore. Each time he looked away, the brightness grew, as if demanding his full attention, and it was at that moment that he noticed something even more disturbing. With each pulse, the silence of the cemetery seemed to gain a new rhythm, as if the entire environment was breathing along with that blue light. The decision to approach wasn't easy, but it seemed inevitable. Each step toward that brightness was like diving into deep, unknown waters, where the silence grew ever thicker and more suffocating. The gravel beneath his boots crunched loudly, as if the ground itself were protesting his choice. He described the sensation as walking through an invisible tunnel, guided only by the blue glow that intensified with every meter he traveled. There was no wind, no crickets chirping, nothing but the rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the rapid beating of his heart, which seemed to respond to the irregular rhythm of the light. As he advanced, the surrounding landscape took on even more disturbing contours. The ancient trees, twisted as if trapped in agony, cast elongated, vivid shadows shaped by the reflected light. The moss on the walls of the tombs seemed to glow, taking on a viscous, almost organic appearance, as if moving in response to his presence. The gravedigger swore that for a few seconds he felt as if the stone corridors were breathing, as if the entire cemetery were in sync with the phenomenon. With each step, the light grew sharper, more hypnotic. It didn't just illuminate, but seemed to tug at his will, pulling him closer like an irresistible magnet. Fear grew within him, but along with it came a strange fascination, an irresistible urge to witness the impossible to its end. It was as if something deep inside his mind whispered that running away wouldn't change anything, that the image of that shining tombstone would follow him, even if he closed his eyes. When he finally reached the oldest part of the cemetery, where the graves stacked side by side like a maze of forgotten stones, the blue revealed itself in all its intensity, and it was at that moment that he realized he was not just facing an unusual light, but a spectacle that involved not only his vision, but also something much darker. When he finally stood before the tombstone, the gravedigger realized that the light was not just an isolated phenomenon, but the center of something much larger. The blue glow expanded in waves that seemed to dissolve the surrounding darkness, but at the same time created new horrors. He reported that he suddenly began to notice figures projected against the stone walls, elongated and distorted silhouettes that moved as if they were human shadows. At first he thought it might be the reflection of his own body multiplied, but soon realized that these forms moved independently, ignoring the logic of the light and his position. Shadows swirled around the tombstone as if engaged in a silent dance. They were tall, short, thin. Some seemed burdened with pain, others hunched over as if bound by invisible chains. He described the sight as hypnotic, simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, as if witnessing a forbidden ritual eternally repeated by souls who had found no rest. At each moment, a new figure appeared, and their number increased, filling the surrounding space in a choreography that followed no music, only the rhythm of the blue light that pulsed like an inverted heart. The gravedigger said that the longer he stared, the harder it became to look away. It was as if those shadows possessed invisible eyes that watched him in return, inviting him, enticing him to join in that disembodied dance. He felt his skin crawl and his breathing became heavy, increasingly difficult to control. The absolute silence reinforced the terror, for no voice, no sound accompanied that spectral movement. It was a scene that shouldn't exist, but it was before him, pulsing with a life of its own. And it was then that he noticed something even more terrifying. The shadows seemed to be slowly approaching, as if they were no longer trapped by the reflection of the light, but free to cross the border between the impossible and the real. He described feeling loneliness weigh down his shoulders like never before. It wasn't just the fear of facing the inexplicable, but the sensation that he had crossed an invisible threshold, a point of no return. The shadows weren't just projected figures, they were presences, and he knew this by the way his body reacted. The air grew chilly. His heart raced, and a shiver ran down his spine, making it clear that he wasn't just looking at something, but being looked at in return. Every step he took seemed accompanied by movements around him, as if those figures were imitating his gestures or surrounding him leisurely, waiting for the right moment to act. He considered running, turning his back, and fleeing that section of the cemetery, never to return. But the dilemma paralyzed him. If he fled, he might never discover what was truly happening there, and that doubt would haunt him forever. On the other hand, staying was defying the impossible, risking being swallowed by something he couldn't even understand. It was as if the ground itself was breathing beneath his feet, each pulse of the blue light bringing with it a feeling of suffocation, as if the air were being ripped from his lungs with each beat. The gravedigger claimed he began to hear small cracks behind him, as if twigs were breaking under invisible footsteps. But when he turned, there was nothing but dense fog and shadows that continued to dance around the tombstone. Panic rose within him like an uncontrollable flame, and yet he could not escape. It was as if the light had created an invisible prison, forcing him to witness it until the end. And just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he felt the surroundings transform in an even more terrifying way. The shadows were no longer just dancing around the light. Now they seemed to converge toward the center, as if preparing to reveal something that should never be seen. It was at that moment that the macabre spectacle reached its climax. The shadows that had previously merely swirled around the tombstone began to multiply uncontrollably, filling every space between the trees and the narrow stone corridors. They moved in sync, as if trapped in an ancient and forbidden choreography, and the gravedigger swore there was a pattern to their movements, something reminiscent of a ritual. There was no sound of instruments, but he began to hear in the back of his mind a kind of muffled chant, like distant voices repeating words in a language he didn't recognize. With each pulse of the blue light, the chorus grew louder, echoing within his chest, until it became impossible to distinguish whether it was coming from outside or inside his own head. The cold intensified, and he described his teeth chattering involuntarily, not just from the weather, but from the fear that gripped every fiber of his body. The blue light, which had previously seemed to merely pulse, now expanded in bursts, illuminating the statues and causing the stone angels to cast distorted shadows, their elongated wings and empty eyes seemingly coming to life for a few seconds. The air filled with a heavy, almost electrical energy, making his skin sting as if small shocks were coursing through his arms. He tried to take a step back, but found he couldn't move his legs. He was trapped, paralyzed, forced to watch this impossible celebration. The shadows danced in circles, bending, contorting, and at one point they seemed to form recognizable faces, as if the dead buried there were using this demonstration to display their laments. The gravedigger swore he saw children, women and men screaming soundlessly, all trapped in a ballet of agony. And then, at the height of terror, the blue light exploded into a blinding clarity, engulfing everything in a bluish white that seared his vision. When he opened his eyes again, there was nothing left, only absolute silence, the darkness returning to its place, and the tombstone, motionless, cold, as if nothing had happened. When silence fell over the cemetery again, the gravedigger remained motionless, breathing heavily, trying to understand if he was still conscious or if he had completely lost control of his mind. The headstone before him now seemed ordinary, cold, worn by time, without any trace of the brightness that had illuminated the entire necropolis minutes before. Yet inside, nothing was the same. The chants, the dancing figures, the distorted faces, all of it remained etched like fire in his memory, as if he had witnessed a forbidden ceremony never to be revealed to the living. He claimed he could never again pass through that area without feeling a deep chill, as if something still lurked, watching him from the darkness. The conviction that some graves hold not only mortal remains, but also secrets from another dimension haunted him until his last day of work. For him, that blue tombstone was not just an isolated phenomenon, but proof that hidden portals exist in places where silence should be absolute. Portals that open only to those who dare to be present at the wrong moment, under the gaze of the shadows that never rest. And it is precisely at this point that the story becomes even more disturbing, because this wasn't the only instance of an inexplicable light appearing in the dead of night. A few weeks later, another gravedigger in a different cemetery reported seeing a tomb glow golden, and what he found upon approaching was even more disconcerting, something that shook not only his mind, but also his faith. Have you ever imagined walking through a fog-shrouded cemetery and suddenly noticing that a single headstone seems to glow in the darkness as if it had a life of its own? I'm not talking about occasional reflections of light or the flickering flame of a forgotten candle, but a golden clarity emanating from the stone like a beacon planted in the midst of death. This was the experience recounted by a gravedigger in Salem, Massachusetts, a man accustomed to the heavy silence of early morning hours and the narrow passages between ancient tombs, but who that night encountered something that defied all logic. He wasn't the type to make up stories to impress. On the contrary, he was reserved, practical, with his feet firmly rooted in routine. Yet, when he spoke of that night, his voice carried a mixture of fear and awe, as if he had witnessed something that should never be seen. Imagine yourself in his shoes. The clock was already past midnight. The city slept shrouded in the cold coastal. Humidity and the fog covered everything like a thick veil that obscured even the outlines of the trees. The cemetery was so silent that every footstep seemed to echo for miles. Every breath felt like an intruder within that heavy atmosphere. It was in this scenario that the light began to shine through, piercing the darkness as if calling out to anyone who dared to look. At first, he thought he was tired, that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when he blinked several times and the light remained, pulsing in golden hues, he realized it wasn't the result of an exhausted mind. And the more he looked, the stronger became the feeling that that tombstone not only illuminated, but called to him, as if wanting to be found in the fog. If these stories are already stirring your imagination, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that the Gravediggers never had the courage to tell out loud. That night in Salem felt different from the moment the Gravedigger walked through the cemetery gates. The fog was so thick that one could barely see more than a few steps ahead, and the air felt unusually chilly, as if every particle carried an invisible weight. He described the sensation as like walking inside a heavy dream, where time drags and every sound echoes louder than it should. Even the rustle of leaves seemed muffled, as if the entire world had been swallowed by an unnatural silence. The wind, which normally made the tree branches creak, like ancient bones, had disappeared, and the only thing filling the space was the rhythmic sound of his own breathing. The cemetery was already renowned for its antiquity and the stories circulating among locals, but the Gravedigger had never paid attention to rumors. To him, death was routine, and the graves were nothing more than cold stones that held memories. Yet that night, the atmosphere seemed too charged, as if something were about to happen. The weight of the fog was not only in the air, but also in his mind, an oppression that grew as he progressed through the narrow corridors, lined with ancient tombstones that emerged from the mist like immobile sentinels. He reported that the darkness became almost solid, forcing his eyes to desperately search for any sign of light, any landmark that might guide him. It was at that moment, amid the suffocating darkness, that a golden dot began to stand out in the distance. At first he thought it was merely the flame of a candle left by some late visitor, but the steady glow of that glow belied the instability of a flame. It was fixed, solid, and seemed more intense by the second. And so it was that in the midst of that night of dense fog, he realized that something impossible was beginning to manifest itself before his eyes, breaking the barrier between the silence of death and the curiosity of the living. He said it took his eyes a moment to believe what they were seeing. The gold stood out amid the fog like a lone star, but it didn't flicker, waver, or fade. At first, he tried to convince himself it could only be the reflection of a poorly positioned streetlight, perhaps the light from a car passing on a distant street, but he soon discarded these ideas. The glow was static, fixed, and most disturbing of all, it seemed to come from within the cemetery, not from outside. Each time he blinked, the brightness became clearer, revealing soft contours and radiating an energy unlike anything he had ever seen. The Gravedigger described how, for a moment, he thought someone had left a large candle on a grave, but there was something wrong with the way the light behaved. It didn't flicker with the breeze, nor did it vary in intensity like a common flame. On the contrary, it was constant, steady, as if emanating from its own source. The gold filtered through the mist and created almost metallic reflections on the nearby tombstones, transforming the environment into an unreal scene. The stones, once grey and silent, now seemed covered in a golden veil, as if every detail held secrets that should not be revealed. As he watched, the strangeness grew. It wasn't just a brightness illuminating the surroundings. It was a presence, a force that seemed to invite him closer. He described there as something hypnotic about the gold, something that made him forget for a moment the night's chill and the stifling humidity. It was as if that light carried a promise, a hidden message that could only be understood if he had the courage to come closer. And it was precisely this silent call that made him take the first step towards the inexplicable, as if an invisible road had been opened right before his feet. He said that as he decided to approach, the mist itself seemed to react to his movement. It was as if the golden light had the power to cut through the darkness, slowly pushing aside the dense fog and creating a narrow passage that seemed tailor-made for him. Each step he took caused the heavy air to disperse for a few moments, only to close in again behind him as if to prevent any return. This feeling of being led, guided by a force he didn't understand, filled him with paralyzing fear, but also with a strange attraction that prevented him from retreating. Gradually, the cemetery began to reveal itself in a different light. The twisted, moss-covered trees took on golden contours that made them appear as living sculptures, leaning in to observe him. Ancient tombstones, many already cracked and covered in moisture, reflected the light like broken mirrors, each reflection creating the illusion of invisible eyes following him from every angle. The gravedigger described how, at times, he felt as if the names engraved on the stones were shimmering, as if the letters shone only for him, sending secret messages he could never decipher. The sound of his own footsteps seemed amplified. The gravel cracked like bones crunching, and his breathing echoed like an intruder in the silence. But most disturbing was the sensation that, with each step toward the glow, something was moving in the periphery of his vision. Short, fleeting shadows that disappeared as soon as he turned his face. Yet the light remained there, steady, untouchable, always at the same distance, as if awaiting his arrival. And it was then, as he walked through the last golden-lit corridor, that he finally came across the tomb that seemed to be calling to him, as if it had chosen him among all the others to reveal a secret that should never be revealed. When he finally stood before the tombstone, the gravedigger realized there was no mistake. The light wasn't coming from a candle, nor from any external object. It was the stone itself that glowed, as if its surface had been imbued with an invisible fire. The gold seemed to emanate from the cracks, spreading in thin, gently pulsing lines, reminiscent of illuminated veins running beneath the skin of a living body. He described the sight as both fascinating and terrifying, because each pulse of light seemed synchronized with his own heart, creating a connection that shouldn't exist between a living man and a cold stone. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and dread, he reached out a trembling hand and touched the tombstone. It was at that moment that the shock set in. The stone wasn't cold, as any rock should be on a damp morning. On the contrary, it was hot, almost burning, as if it housed something alive inside, something that breathed slowly and transmitted its heat outward. The sensation made his body stiffen, and for a few seconds he couldn't move, overcome by the absurd contrast of the experience. He said that with every second he was in contact with the stone, a pressure grew within his mind, as if the tombstone wanted to communicate something. There were no words, no sounds, but a silent impulse that made him believe he was about to discover a secret buried beneath that glow. His skin crawled, and his eyes fixed on the engraved name, almost as if the light itself were guiding him to that inscription. And it was at that very moment, as he strained his eyes against the pulsing gold, that he realized something that chilled his blood more than anything else that night. As he looked closer at the inscription engraved on the stone, he realized it was no ordinary name, lost in the oblivion of time. The letters, illuminated by the pulsating gold, stood out as if they had been engraved the instant they were observed. Each line shone with frightening clarity, revealing not only someone's name, but also dates so recent they seemed impossible. Surprise turned to panic when he recognized that identity. It was the name of a person still alive, someone who lived in the same city, and who, as far as I knew, was in good health. The shock was so intense that he instinctively recoiled, stumbling on the gravel, his heart racing. His mind refused to accept what his eyes saw, but there was no room for error. The name was there, engraved on the tombstone, fixed, immutable, as if it were a sentence already written. He described feeling a profound vertigo, as if he were looking into an inevitable future, a cruel anticipation of what had not yet happened. The feeling of being confronted by a deadly warning grew within him. It was as if that golden light served not only to illuminate, but also to reveal truths that should never be seen. With each pulse, it seemed as if the stone whispered, "The time is coming," he swore he felt that the heat from the tombstone transmitted something more than energy. It was as if it were a sign of life, but of a life that shouldn't be there. The dilemma was unbearable. Tell someone about what he had seen and be thought insane, or keep to himself a secret so heavy it would haunt him until the end of his days. But he didn't have time to think much, because even as he was still processing the horror of that revelation, the light began to intensify, and the silence of the night was replaced by something even more disturbing, as if the tomb itself were about to respond to his presence. He said that while he was still trying to comprehend the revelation before his eyes, the intensity of the light suddenly increased. The gold, which had previously pulsed in slow intervals, now vibrated in rapid, almost frantic waves, illuminating the entire surroundings as if it were day. The heat also intensified. It was no longer just the warm sensation of heated stone, but a suffocating, living heat, as if the tombstone had transformed into a body that breathed on its own. With each touch of light, he swore he felt vibrations in the ground, as if something were moving beneath the earth, pressing to escape. It was then that he heard it. They weren't clear words, but a muffled, rhythmic sound, like human breathing. He described it as a heavy, slow, panting sound that seemed to come from within the tomb, growing in intensity as if the occupant of that grave were struggling to escape. The gravedigger recoiled, unable to believe what he was witnessing. His mind wavered between running and staying, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, forced to witness it until the end. With each passing second, the sound grew closer, clearer, as if the very air vibrated with that impossible breath. Panic gripped him, for the name on the headstone still pulsed in his mind. How could he hear someone alive inside a grave that shouldn't yet exist? How could he accept that? Death had come early, marking its prey before its time. The clarity then exploded with an almost unbearable intensity. He raised his arms to shield his eyes, but the heat was so intense he thought his skin would burn. At the height of his terror, he took a few steps back, and suddenly everything went black. The light vanished, breathing ceased, and the mist covered the cemetery again in absolute silence, as if nothing had happened. When the light went out, the gravedigger remained motionless, unable to breathe deeply, fearing that even the sound of his breathing might reawaken that which seemed to have fallen silent. The tombstone before him was nothing more than a cold stone, worn by humidity, devoid of any sign of warmth or shine. Yet inside him, nothing was the same. The memory of the engraved name, the muffled sound of a breath that couldn't possibly exist, and the warmth he'd felt with his own hands remained with him like an invisible scar. He knew it wasn't his imagination. And the most disturbing part was yet to come. Days later, confirmation came like a final sentence. The person whose name shone on that tombstone had died suddenly, with no plausible explanation. For the gravedigger, it was no coincidence. Experience convinced him that some tombs not only hold the dead, but also herald those yet to join them, as if death itself were in a hurry to write its next victim, and the cemetery were merely the cruel messenger revealing the chosen ones. This account is not an isolated story. There are other testimonies from gravediggers in different parts of the United States who claim to have witnessed strange lights, impossible movements, and signs that seem to portend inevitable fates. What we witness here may be only the surface of a deeper secret, a mystery that repeats itself in forgotten cemeteries, night after night, waiting for eyes brave enough to see. If you want to discover the next stories, get ready, because with each story, the darkness grows denser, and the signs more disturbing. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. What comes next may be even more disturbing than anything you've heard so far.